So I am very happy to introduce our speaker, and this is someone who I feel like in the six months that we have been working together, we have gotten to know each other and a lot about each other, and so I'm super thrilled that she's here. Tiffany Taylor-Smith is a cultural competency consultant with experience in higher education and human resources. She currently serves as the Assistant Vice President of Diversity and Inclusion in the Office of Diversity and Inclusion at the University of Dayton. In this role, Taylor-Smith leads the development, implementation, and assessment of comprehensive campus-wide professional development and training to promote and enhance intercultural competence, diversity, equity, and inclusive excellence. Prior to her role at UD, Taylor-Smith worked for 15 years with education, businesses, and community organizations to increase intercultural competence for both adults and students. In 2001, she founded T.R. Taylor Consulting, LLC, now Culture Learning Partners, to help build better cross-cultural relations, navigate cultural diversity, and increase cultural equity. In addition to her consulting experience, Taylor-Smith worked as an adjunct professor of psychology at Kean University and Seton Hall University in New Jersey for 11 years. She taught courses on lifespan development, child and adolescent psychology. Before founding the consulting firm, Taylor-Smith held various roles in human resource development, diversity and sales management with Procter & Gamble Distributing Company, working at the corporation's Boston, Cincinnati, and Cranford, New Jersey offices. She earned a bachelor's degree in psychology from the University of Rochester in Rochester, New York, and a master's degree in education specializing in counseling services from Fordham University in New York. She is currently, and this is something we've bonded over, a doctoral candidate at the University of Dayton in the Educational Leadership PhD program. It is my privilege to introduce to you and welcome Tiffany Taylor-Smith to Chaminade.
Good evening. So I got permission to take my mask off, so everybody's away from me, so thank you. Thank you for the prayer and the introduction. It is a true blessing to be here with you and to have spent this time here at Chaminade University. I bring you greetings from the University of Dayton, aloha, and I want to begin with a land acknowledgement. And I had hoped that I could pull this off. And Allison, as big as we made this, I'm still gonna require some assistance. So I'm pulling out the glasses. Aloha, my name is Tiffany. I am a guest on this INI, and I can currently trace my family's roots to Ohio, Tennessee, Savannah, Georgia, West Africa, and Ireland. As we gather, we would like to begin by acknowledging Hawaii as an indigenous space where the descendants of the original people are Kanaka, Maoli, or Native Hawaiian. The Ainai on which we gather is located in the Apu Aha of Waikiki, in the Moku of Kona, on the Mokupini of Oahu, in the Pai'ainai of Hawaii. My mother would be so proud of me. And my dad, yes. This land is part of the larger territory recognized by Indigenous Hawaiians as the ancestral grandmother, Papa Hana'a Moko. We recognize that Her Majesty Queen Lili Ono Kalani yielded the Hawaiian Kingdom as these territories in 1893 under the duress and protest to the United States to avoid the bloodshed of her people, who are recognized in the kingdom's law. We further recognize that generations of Indigenous Hawaiians and their knowledge systems shaped Hawaii in a substantial way that allow us to enjoy her gifts today. Mahalo. I am a student who continues to learn. And I appreciate that about my life, and I hope that you are here because of that as well. So I want to take some time this evening just to spend a little bit of time with you talking about one of the things that I enjoy talking about most, and that really is looking at our cultural stories and how we become the people that we are and what influences the things that we see around us, how we see ourselves, and how we see others. Spend a quick moment around some definitions, diversity, equity, inclusion, as well as intercultural competence. Talk about bias, right? So what is bias and how does it influence all of us? And then lastly, just the importance of continuing cultural conversations. Again, that's one of the things that I am blessed to be able to have the opportunity to do and get paid to do it, so that's nice as well. So I just want to lay out when I do this work, it's so important to talk about conversation norms, kind of like the ethos of our space, how we want to be in this space together. And whenever I do workshops, particularly when people are going to engage with each other, you're just not going to listen to me talk. I'm going to have a couple opportunities for you to talk to each other. So I want to just invite you to kind of take these in our time together. So staying engaged, obviously you're kind of in a room, so you kind of have no choice to. Can't really hide. Sharing airtime. So there are two opportunities I'm going to give you to speak to one another. So just asking that when you partner with someone, you make sure that you're speaking, but also make sure you give them, it's not just your voice you're hearing, you want to make sure you hear your partner's voice as well. These subjects can be difficult, and in some ways, we have to give each other grace. So be patient with yourself as well as each other. None of us woke up with this morning with every thing that we're going to say perfectly scripted as to not have any negative impact on someone else. None of us. I always say that if and when, I should say when, I develop the app that will come to you at 6:45 in the morning to tell you, these are the things you should think about today as you have some conversations. I'll be on a beach in Fiji, and you'll be getting that app from me as I enjoy my life. It'll be a combination of things. I know I'll get too bored if I sit there too long. Speak from your perspective. Each of you has a story. Each of you has a story that has defined who you are. And it's not up to me or anyone else to judge or to determine the validity of your story. It's your story. Notice your judgments. So as a social scientist, I'm always fascinated by the way in which we have been conditioned based on our life experiences to develop judgments. As we see people or situations, our brain is constantly sizing up what's going on. And in some ways, we judge. We judge individuals, we judge situations, we judge groups of people. So just notice that, and I'll reinforce that a couple times. We're all teachers and learners. I come to you tonight with some experiences that I've had, some research I've done, some writing I've done, but we're going to learn from each other, and you're going to learn from each other as well. And then lastly, in the times that I invite you to share with someone, I ask that you respect confidentiality in that space. So if someone shares something with you about themselves, that you hold that with them and that it not get repeated outside of the time that we spent together, okay? So a lot of times when I do this work, particularly in this day and age, there are ways in which we see each other, right? So there are things that you can look at me and tell. And I'm normally not used to doing a microphone, so he told me if I bring it with me, it will still record, so I'll do that. So how many of you are familiar with seeing some version of the iceberg? Okay, so I like this because it gives us a visual to think about how we see ourselves. So the visual on the left is us as individuals, right? So there are things that you can look at me and clearly see. I'm a woman, I'm brown, I wear my hair a certain way. One I always laugh about is that three-letter word up there, age. Right, so we have to be very careful about that, particularly with some folks that we think may be one age when they're not, and you can go either way with that. So the other one that I have recently gotten feedback, which I think is really helpful, is gender. Because what I've learned and heard and getting feedback on is that gender should be halfway in the water, halfway out of the water. Because there are some individuals that we look at, we can't necessarily put them in a particular gender box. So thinking about when we look at each other, what we see, and the judgments that we potentially have based on what we see. But the beauty of this is look at how much we can't see. and how much that could inform who I am. You don't know my talents, you don't know my family size, you don't know my personality profile, my life experiences, my heritage, my skills, my beliefs. Those things you would only know is if you got to know me, or if you read about it somewhere. But ideally, even as we think about each other, is what we learn as we build community together. Okay, so there's the individual. Here at Chaminade, you all function in a community. And this is the individual, but then each of us brings our icebergs into the community. And then in the community, like for me, I had never been to Hawaii before. I will never say Hawaii the same again. I was telling somebody, when I go back to Dayton and I say it that way, they're gonna like, you go to Hawaii for 5 days and now you talk like you're from Hawaii. But I can't say it the same way anymore. So for me coming out here, I spent time on your website. So there are things that I could look at, anyone can look at, to kind of learn about what's the surface of Chaminade University. And those are the things that anyone can see. But when I got here, there's some other things, and other things that I learned in conversation with people. So at the top of the right corner, it says the way we say we get things done, and in the lower left corner, it says the way we really get things done. But I wouldn't know that unless I was here or had conversations with multiple folks to really get a sense of that. And part of what happens here, this is my favorite, this is unwritten rules. How do you learn those? Somebody has to teach it to you or tell you, right? Or you figure it out by trial and error. So when we think about who we are as individuals, and then how we potentially show up in the community, but we bring this with us into here. Okay? So what happens, which is really fascinating at this day and age, is the level of generations that we have in one institution. And that's not just here. That's organizations and communities across the country, across the world, of the baby boomers, traditionalists, Generation X, millennials, Generation Z. We are all in space together, navigating, communicating, learning, growing, sharing. All of those things influence. So we have 5 generations in spaces. Even as I look across this room, that has an impact, because each generation has a certain story based on the time that they grew up in and what information they learned about themselves and what they learned about others. Okay? So at this point, I usually ask people to kind of do a pulse check, because there's a varying degrees of emotions that you could be having at any given moment. And some of you are probably like, what is she about to say? Where is this going to go? Am I going to be comfortable with this conversation? Am I going to be uncomfortable? All of those things could be going on in your brain. So I always just like to acknowledge that. And it could be any one of those things. You could be excited about it. You could be nervous. You could be peaceful, powerful, joyful, you name it. But all of those potentially determine how you take in the information and how you respond. So just to be aware of that, I always like to bring that into the space. Social scientist in me, yes. So one semester when I was teaching at King University and focused on adolescent psychology, a group of students did a presentation on identity development. And this was the visual that they used to talk about identity. And I love it and continue to use it because I think of each of us as kind of like this blob, if you will, and each of us has an ethnicity. We have things that we believe, values that we've been taught, ways in which we have interests, how we dress, the choices that we make. My favorite is this one right here, the influence that friends and family had on us and how we saw ourselves. And thinking about each of us in this space creates all these blobs that kind of come together and make a bigger blob. Okay, so identity and our identity is formed, and you can add so many other things to this. You could add religion, you could add gender, you could add race. Like there's so many other ways in which we come to form our identity, where we grew up, who we grew up around. All of those things impact our identity. Okay? All right, so your chance, your turn to talk. So I'm going to ask you to do 2 things. Think about it, and then I'm going to give my response so you have a chance to hear my reaction to the questions. And then I'm going to invite you to turn and partner with someone close to you. And it could be someone sitting next to you, behind you. If you are sitting, I will challenge you to do this though. If you're sitting next to someone that you already know and have pretty close relationship with, find somebody else. Okay? And that's an invitation, it's your choice, but that's just a moment to think about it in that way. So there are two things I want you to do. This is cultural story. So we're talking about who we are and how we come to be sitting in this room. Okay, me standing, he standing, but in this space together. So share your cultural identity and share your family history. Okay, yes, you have 3 minutes to do that, but it's gonna be quick, trust me. So when you talk about cultural identity, okay, what is your cultural identity? Okay, and I'm gonna give you mine. So it is not given mine is to kind of help you think about what your response might be, but it doesn't necessarily mean you have to follow exactly what I've done. Okay, so I am Black, African American. I am a Christian. I speak one language. I'm middle class. I am cisgender. I am a mom. I'm a cultural competence educator, and I'm a woman. Okay, so those are, when I think of who I am, my identity and my culture, those are the things that are most significant to me. And I'm from the Midwest, so I gotta claim that. And then when I talk about your family history, so this is the part where you think about, okay, where did my family come from? Okay, and this takes on all different types of meaning. But there was a period of time that I didn't do this exercise because I had just recovered from Ancestry DNA. Has anyone ever done Ancestry DNA? Was anyone who did it surprised? Okay, so maybe it was just me then. Okay, so there were some things that my family told us that we believed forever, and come to find out it was not true. So it was like rattling for all of us. So my parents are, my mother's side of the family came to Ohio from Tennessee, and it's European as well as Indian and African. My dad's family came to Ohio my grandfather came from Savannah, Georgia, African, and my grandmother, who we were told forever was Cherokee Indian, Ancestry DNA confirmed that she was Irish and from Ohio. And even if you looked at her pictures, usually I show that in an exercise that I do, and then people look at me like, how did you think she was Native American? But if you're told something, that's what you believe. Like, no one ever challenged it before. Anyway, so we continue to work that out in therapy in the Taylor family, but we're getting there. And there's been so much more that actually confirms that she was Irish and come from Irish ancestry. So that's me. That's it. Okay? So as much as you can share, feel comfortable sharing with someone, let's do that. So I'm going to actually give us a timer. So each person take about 2 minutes to try to share, and I'll check in with you. So I have 6 o'clock. And I'm going to give you 4 minutes, so find someone in the room, and we'll come back together. So how many people feel like you have, at some point in your family history, someone documented, it's either in a book or it's like an oral history, so you feel like you have a really good understanding of your family history? How many people feel like, okay, a couple folks. How many people are kind of in the middle, like, you know, just enough to be dangerous, that you could talk a little bit about your family history? Okay, all right. How many people are on the opposite end of that, where there's like very little information that you have about your family history? Okay, thank you, because you confirm what I have found to be the case across our nation of folks who fall into each one of those categories, particularly when you think about the history of our country and the way in which people came from all over the world and in many ways started families either by force or by natural connection, and that there are ways in which some of us know a lot, some of us know a little, and some of us know very little information. And you can, whether it's through adoption or there was some negative things that happened and no one talked about it. When I first started doing this exercise, I had a woman, white female, mid-50s, who shared that her great-grandfather was a stowaway on a ship, came to New York, and met his wife, had children, family. And the story that got passed down was that he never talked about where he came from for their safety. And it was for their safety that he never shared anything about himself. And so that was the story. No, that was it. And you could kind of see she shared this, even though she didn't know him, but that was the story that was told. So thank you for engaging in that with each other. What I want to do now is just take a few minutes to chat a little about some definitions, just so we can all be on the same page when we hear these terms. And it's just, my opportunity to be the teacher that I never was. So when we talk about, and I'm taking these definitions from the work that we've done at the University of Dayton to really come up with, there were 14 different terms around diversity, equity, and inclusion. And if you go onto our website, particularly the diversity and inclusion website, you'll be able to find those definitions. And we had a task force that worked, commissioned by Dr. Eric Spina, our president, and worked to collaboratively with different committees to come up with these definitions. And they are grounded in who we are as a Catholic and Marianist institution. So we looked at other institutions and made sure that they represent who we are as a Catholic and Marianist institution. So when we talk about diversity, and I'm not going to read these, I just want to let you kind of get a sense for these two different terms. And diversity really is about presence and participation. So that as we think about the various identities that folks are able to be in space, to be seen and to be recognized, and to participate. And then inclusion, and I always talk about inclusion is action. It is not something that just happens organically, right? So, and I'll use an example. When I landed here on Thursday, Allison Jerome picked me up. She brought me to the Marianist Brothers home. Brother Ed welcomed me. Walked me to, actually carried my suitcase. That was a big, you got a lot of points for that one. Up the steps. I was like, no, you don't have to. Nope, got it. Okay, thank you. And there was a sense of, I am welcomed, I'm invited, I'm included. And throughout my entire stay here, I felt like I've been included. So when it talks about practice of active, intentional, and sustained engagement, where each of us feel like we belong. And that has varying degrees of how we do that, but that's inclusion. And it doesn't happen by accident. There has to be some intentional behavior that we exhibit to make someone feel that way. Okay? And then the other two that I want to share with you, and I use these examples, and I realize they're visuals that some of you may have seen and may not, so I have two. As we talk about how many people have seen some version of this, okay? So looking at the distinction between equity and equality. And there's a lot of conversation about that right now. As I've worked with some organizations that said, well, we were focused on providing, equality and being fair. And now we realize what we've been doing, there was more. Like bringing people in and getting them here was one thing, but we needed to make sure that we thought about it in an equitable way. So as you can see, the distinction between the two and equality, giving everybody the same thing, doesn't always work out for everybody, as you can see on the right side. So really thinking about what is it that we have to do that provides that level of fairness, and it cannot necessarily be dictated by our judgments of someone. So this example, get these arrows right. Has anyone seen this version? This version really looks at equality, everybody getting the same bicycle. And you can see that doesn't quite work out for everybody. But when we talk about equity, it's giving people what they need to be successful, what they need to be, to have an experience. And it isn't necessarily based on being the same thing. And part of it is really important as we think about, and this is the challenge that I often invite people to think about, is not necessarily judging because it has to be different. What does success look like for each of these individuals to have this experience of riding a bicycle? And it may be different than what we perceive to be the norm, if you will. And there's a whole other conversation as well. Okay? If you have questions and it's like, feel free to raise your hand and we'll deal with it. I definitely am. I'm going to allot time for Q&A at the end as well. Okay? So when we talk about this work, what you're here tonight doing, what we've had opportunities to do throughout the last couple of days, and I told Allison, this was a divine set of experiences over the last couple of days, and to have the opportunity to hear Father Dan yesterday afternoon was like, okay, wow, and I shared with him that I'm texting people at Dayton, okay, this is what I'm hearing, who am I hearing? And then to realize he's not that far from Dayton, so more to come. So the notion around how we are doing this work, these conversations that we're having, the learning that you're engaged in, what you're participating in is really around increasing your intercultural competence or cultural competence. They use and mean the same thing. How many of you are familiar with the term cultural or intercultural competence? Okay, a couple of folks. I'm gonna keep it brief. It's three things. One, it's your awareness of who you are. So the activity I just had you do where you kind of talk about your own cultural identity. So it's your awareness of who you are culturally, that you have a culture and that there's some things that have been influenced in how you see yourself. That's one. Two, cultural knowledge. What is your knowledge of other cultures? People who are outside of your cultural group. And how did you get that information? Is it from books? Is it from films? Is it from family members, classes that you took, teachers? Personal contact. Do you have relationships that you had at one point or in your life where you learned about someone who's different from you from their perspective, and not just one person? And then last one is cultural skills, and that's what we continue to work at. And I always tell people, if we're going to spend some time together tonight, Allison and I are not going to sign certificates to say, ta-da, you're now culturally competent. Sorry, it doesn't work that way. Cultural competence is a journey. We will spend our lives doing this work. I have spent my life and will continue to. And as a Christian, until God calls me home, I will do this and continue to learn. Because there's no one set of information that you can get in a summer, in a course, in a year, in a degree that will make you culturally competent. Cultures evolve. We evolve. Generations evolve. So there's no way you can learn it in a time period and it be that way forever. You have to continue to work at it. And so when we talk about cultural skills, it's your ability to communicate across cultures, your ability to navigate in different spaces, being aware of the cultural significance of different spaces and respectful, and how you ally or champion for others who don't necessarily have access to the resources that you have. So how do you make that available to others and ally, champion, or in some instances be an accomplice for someone else? And I often invite people to think about, as you see what we call the big 8 areas in diversity, how many times have you been in spaces where you were the only one? As you look at these different descriptions, these different terms, thinking through your life, I invite people to think about, this past summer. Were you ever in a space where you were the only one? And what does that feel like? Not only your own awareness of yourself in that space, but also being aware of how others may be thinking about you. What potential judgments do you have of them, and then what are you thinking they may have of you? And it could even be something they said, or you might even say. Okay, so just the notion around how those fit together. What's important whenever I do this work is to talk about this notion of cultural tapes. And depending on your age, when I say tapes, and it's not the kind you use to tape something together, it could be a 8-track that really dates some folks, myself included, or it could be a cassette tape, or it could be the VCR, right? So right? So for those of you who are familiar with the VCR, and it would record something, and then you could, whether you wanted to or not, re-record over it. In some instances, folks had like TV shows or weddings or special events, births, and then by accident, it got re-recorded and it was gone forever, never to be found again. Our technology has gotten a lot better to allow us to do that. But the notion, as I talk about what's on your cultural tapes, and we'll get into this as we talk about bias, is that each of us, and I try to always pull some visuals around what we may have been taught, particularly if you were educated in the United States. What we were taught about U.S. history. And I identify different cultures and thinking about whose stories were told, whose stories were not told, and ways in which even now we're having this moment in history where we're having to reckon with some of this. Some of the outages, I mean, even in coming here, and I've said this to folks that I've talked to, and even folks I'm texting, family and friends and colleagues, I am really frustrated, was really frustrated when I got here and realized, like, why didn't I know this? Why wasn't I taught about Hawaii and really understanding the impact of the cultures that were here, the Native Indigenous people, but also the people who came here. Whether they came here from China, from Japan, from Portugal, the countries who came here during the time period that they came here and for what purpose they came here for. Those things were not taught. And here I am, 52 years old, visiting Bishop Museum on Saturday, trying, like, intently, okay, where is it written? Like, show me how you're telling this story so I can understand it, because I don't know. And I'm about to have a PhD. And many of my colleagues talk about how you can be educated, have degrees, and have gone through some of the most prestigious institutions in this country and still not know all the history that there is. And even this room, I really enjoyed Friday when we had our meeting, our luncheon here, to walk around and look at these pictures, because they tell a story that I was not taught. So as you think about what's on your cultural tapes, okay, where were you raised? Who were your neighbors? Who were your friends? Who were your teachers? What were the textbooks that you learned from? And what did you learn as it relates to yourself, your family's culture, and then the culture of others? So hold on to that for me for a minute. I want to transition to talking about implicit unconscious bias. So I'll start by, and then I have a short video that I want to share with you. I start by saying that if you breathe air and drink water, you have a bias, or 2 or 10 or 50 or 100. So let's just put that out there. We're going to name that. All of us have biases. It depends on where you grew up around, your age. All of that impacts what you caught and when you caught it. Okay? So we're going to just name that and leave it there, so we can just get past that. We all have them. I want to share a brief video with you, and then we'll come back together. I love it when technology works. Oh.
Psychologist Alexander Todorov has discovered the mathematics underlying our first impressions. Using data he's collected from thousands of people at Princeton University, Dr. Todorov has built a computer program that can pinpoint the very parts of a face that trigger our gut instincts. That is, whether someone looks aggressive, introverted, attractive, and so on. See for yourself. As quickly as you can, answer this question. Which of these two people is more trustworthy, A or B? And what about from this pair? And this one? This probably wasn't hard, and in fact, you could have done it even faster. Here's Dr. Todorov.
You don't need more than 160 to 100 milliseconds to get pretty much the same first impression you will get from a limited time.
This was Dr. Todorov's first finding, that first impressions are fast. The second finding is perhaps even more surprising. Almost everyone sees the same thing. Consider the faces you just saw. If you're like the majority of people in Dr. Todorov's studies, these are the ones you chose as being more trustworthy. And what about competence? Just look at this face created by Dr. Todorov's software. The changes to this face are small. The tilt of the mouth, the size of the brow, the distance between the eyes. And yet, taken together, these features trigger a judgment. If we're honest, we'll admit that this face seems to be gaining and losing IQ points right in front of our very eyes. We're all familiar with sayings like, don't judge a book by its cover. But we do. And Dr. Todorov's studies show this too.
We did some studies presenting participants' faces of politicians, and it turns out that using judgments of naive participants, we can predict about 70% of the electoral outcomes. In a nutshell, politicians who happen to look more competent than their rivals are more likely to win in the elections.
These findings, which included almost every major congressional candidate for the 2004 to 2008 elections, are incredible. Campaign promises, advertisements, and experience aside, what really matters is how you look. And faces don't just sway who we elect to lead our governments. They also affect who we hire, who we give opportunities to, who we promote. Now, if everyone sees the same thing when they look at a face, It raises the question, are these impressions accurate? Do people look more competent because they actually are more competent? Do they look more trustworthy because they are more trustworthy? The short answer is no.
Often the natural assumption is there must be some kernel of truth in these impressions, but if you look closely at the data, there's very, very little evidence that these judgments are accurate. In many situations, you can ignore completely the face and your judgment will be much better.
If faces are so misleading, the question then of course is why? Why do our brains do this? Here's a popular theory for the case of trustworthiness. We look more trustworthy the more we look like babies. Large eyes, small chins, round faces, these are the features we love about infants, the most trustworthy creatures there are. So when adults possess these features, we view them as more trustworthy, kind, and honest. Research tells us we're more likely to agree with baby-faced adults, to accept their offers in negotiations. We're even less likely to convict baby-faced defendants for premeditated crimes, and more likely to give them more lenient sentences when we do. And what does this mean for the workplace? Are baby-faced employees more likely to get the benefit of the doubt in a workplace dispute? Does the width of your jaw influence your hireability? Clearly, our first impressions can get us into trouble. So let's talk about how to get around them and make better decisions. It's hard. First impressions are fast and they're automatic. But if we can admit that these judgments happen, we can find simple ways to outsmart our minds. How many times have you said or heard something like this?
I felt like I could trust her as soon as I met her.
Or, I can really see him in this role. When you catch these moments, ask a simple question. Based on what? Want something stronger? Here's one senior leader in education's strategy. As soon as I meet someone, I acknowledge my first impression in the first 5 seconds and spend the rest of the interview trying to prove myself wrong. Be your own devil's advocate by challenging your first impressions. Finally, when applicable, try putting off the face-to-face early on in the hiring process. Focus on hard evidence of skill, talent, and experience that's in a resume or other objective forms of data as a first step. We can all be blinded by first impressions, but with regular practice, we can learn to look past the surface.
What's interesting about this video, which I like using, is it really just gives us another way to kind of think about what has been stored in our brain about the perceptions and judgments that we make about individuals. So when we talk about this notion of implicit bias, we really are talking about a part of our brain that stores that information on our cultural tapes. Remember I talked about that? So how many of you, so this is my science people, are familiar with an area of the brain called the amygdala? Ooh, good. So the amygdala, I always say, the amygdala is a bad mamma jamma. There's no other way to say it. So it is in the lower stem of your brain, and it's like the size of a hard shell peanut. Very small, very powerful. So the amygdala's responsibility really is designed to protect us. That's its job. And it stores all these things that's on your tapes throughout your life of what's safe. Who's safe? What situations does it need to protect you from in order to keep you safe? So when you think about, and I often think when I speak with different groups, I ask them to think about, growing up, were you told to stay away from strangers? Or as parents, for parents in the room, or aunts, uncles, do you tell children in your life to be careful and stay away from strangers? Who were the strangers? What did they look like? Where did they live? And what happens as an adult when that stranger is sitting next to you? Or that stranger is a classmate or your roommate or a student or someone applying for a position? Those thoughts are going to go off. It's kind of, so again, I date myself. For Danger, Will Robinson, Lost in Space. And she would, danger. So that's what our brain is saying. Danger. Something about this person, based on what's on your cultural tapes, is not safe. And our cultural competence works when we have to think about, why am I thinking this about that person? Particularly if you don't know them. Right? You're doing it based on what you see. The iceberg, remember we talked about kind of those visuals of what we recognize. The example I often use is if I'm working late in my office and I'm on campus and I'm walking to my car, it's dark, and there are a group of young men walking towards me, 3 or 4 of them. I could care less what the color of their skin is. I'm doing 2 things. One, I'm determining, do they look like students here? Do they look like they've been drinking? And is this a safe situation? So and our amygdala is not politically correct. It could care less about hurting their feelings. It is going to tell Tiffany what Tiffany needs to do to be safe. And it means you either get on the phone and talk as you're walking to your car, call security, or you go back in your office. Like that's in that moment, it's like instantaneous around what I need to do. So as you think about the different scenarios and situations and what you were exposed to and what might be on your cultural tapes, that's a way for you to think about, who might I judge in a certain way based on what's on my cultural tapes and my lived experience. So when we talk about implicit bias, it really is our attitudes and stereotypes that affect the way that we engage and how we understand each other, things that we might do. What's interesting is the second bullet point talks about more than 85% of all Americans consider themselves to be unprejudiced. Yet research has concluded that a majority of people in the United States hold some degree of implicit racial bias. What I always invite you to do is take out race and put in gender. Take out gender and put in religion. So you can see there, I would never say, if someone asked me, no, I don't have any racial bias. But I know I do. I know I do, based on where I grew up, who I grew up around, and the era that I grew up in. There are certain things that I have to work at every day. Okay? There's a lot of work that's being done by Dr. Banaji and Dr. Greenwald at Harvard University. They do work on blind spots. I'll talk a little bit more about that as I wrap up. It's something you could do to learn a little bit more. There are 2 things that happen as a result of our biases. They develop categories and lead to stereotyping. So our brain kind of puts people in buckets. It stores, okay, people like this are in this bucket, people like that in that bucket, and that's how we, it's interesting, and I'm sure many of you can attest to people, depending on where you have gone, and people look at you like, well, what are you? Because they're trying to figure out what bucket to put you in, because that's the way their brain is wired in some ways. And then we stereotype based on attributes that people fit in those certain groups and what our experiences have been with folks in those groups. Studies show that it's the physical things that we can see. Remember the top of the iceberg? Those are the ones that have the highest percent of implicit bias because they're visible. They're readily, you can see it. Those are the ones that we have a higher level of judgments and potential bias for. Okay? So now that I've given you doom and gloom and you now know you all have bias and you just got a lot of work to do, right? We all have a lot of work to do. But there's ways that we can continue to work at this. And that's what I like about it, because it's an ever-growing challenge. The more we become aware of it, the more it's an opportunity for us to think about this. So, your turn now. I want you to reflect on your cultural story that you shared when we first started talking, your family, how you see yourself, and then your upbringing. And think about, kind of reflect on what potential unintentional and unconscious bias, what might be your blind spots? What might be the areas where you just have limited information, or your information is consistent, but you haven't had any exposure or experience to challenge that? So for me, even, I love how I get these real-time examples. I will never think about Hawaii the same. I have a deeper understanding of the cultures, the ethnic identities that make up this beautiful place. And I also understand the history. And I consider myself to be a very culturally curious person, to my parents' chagrin as well as to my children, because I want to understand, help me understand this. So as you think about it, what might that be for you? What's on your cultural tapes, potentially, given where you grew up, who you grew up around, when you grew up, Who were your teachers? Who were your classmates? Who were your friends? How have those things potentially, and even who were the strangers? Okay, so this is your invitation to find someone else in the room to have a conversation with. If you don't know them, introduce yourself. And I'm gonna give you got like 3 minutes, like quickly think about what might be some biases that you carry based on your cultural tapes and cultural story. Make sense? Question? Okay, find someone else and chat, and then we'll come back together. You got 3 minutes. So how many people feel like you have a somewhat of a sense of how you might have some bias? Okay, all right, good. And if you don't, I'll give you my card, and you can follow up with me, and we'll schedule some time to dig a little deeper into that. So we all have them, and we'll keep working at it. So, okay. Tiffany, now what do I do? So part of what I offer is the implicit association test. Have anybody ever heard of the IAT, implicit association test? It actually, Dr. Banaji and Dr. Greenwald, there's a group of researchers through Harvard University have developed this tool. It's an online tool, online instrument, and it's a way, and it's just basically you're using your fingers to click and you're responding kind of like the video that I just showed, and you're responding to what you think about the images that you see. There are 14 different categories based on race, ethnicity, gender, religion, there's politics, there's several different areas where you can kind of go in, age, and I've had groups who I have taken before I work with them and want to challenge the instrument. I'm not a defender, I don't get any money or benefit from referring people to it. The idea is that, what if it were true? What if what it tells you were true? What is that? Just an opportunity for some reflection and just to think about it. And it's not, this isn't like, okay, you are XYZ forever, like you're marked. It's just an instrument that allows you to kind of go do a deeper dive, if you will, and to do some more reflection. Discovering these biases should not make you feel ashamed or feel as though you're being labeled a racist, a sexist, an ageist. It's the notion that, one, we have them, and then how do we work at, as I call it, re-recording over some of the information that's on our tapes. And what experiences do I need to have seeking feedback, engaging with different groups, particularly as you think about who were the strangers and how that could impact you now. And what relationships and what information do you need to go get about those strangers to help you re-record over what's stored already in here. And we can unlearn what we've been taught and work to combat it. Again, it's intentional and it's a choice that you have. It won't just happen naturally. You really have to make a decision that that's something that you want to do. There's a recent book out called Biased, which allows further resource or reference, practicing meditation, really being mindful as you really try to pay attention. Again, I go back to in the beginning when I talked about notice your judgments. That's like a key to helping us understand, particularly in any given situation. I mean, even when I walked in the room where you saw me, it's like, I'm sure there were some things that you maybe thought about me before I even opened my mouth. And again, it's based on people who look like me and what your experiences and knowledge and information might be of someone. And we do that for each other, so it's not like I'm singling myself out, because I do it for you as well, because I was conditioned to do that, right? So just acknowledging it and then thinking about what do I need to learn, practicing empathy, using tools and instruments, learning about other cultures and other groups is a huge way to combat our biases. And what I always tell people, unfortunately, we don't know all of the biases that we carry because they're unconscious and they're not always in the forefront of our thought. They're kind of, nestled back there. And our cultural experiences have kind of given those to us, so it feeds into the implicit bias that we have. And there's this term called microaggressions, which I'm not going to go into this evening, but are you familiar with microaggressions? Yeah. So our implicit bias can feed into microaggressions. So it's that unintentional comment that we might make to someone that really is, it can be interpreted as offensive. And it often happens to marginalized, underrepresented identities who speak so well. I have a colleague that I work with, identifies as Korean. She's born and raised in New Jersey, travels around the country doing diversity work. And no matter where she goes, and she gets into a cab or an Uber, and they ask her where she's from, and she'll say Jersey. And they're like, where are you really from? I'm really from New Jersey. And so it's that notion that I can't be from New Jersey, like I have to be from someplace else. I have a hunch that some of you can identify with that, particularly if you travel to the mainland or outside of Hawaii. So those, and that they come from there. And then what happens over time, as our cultural competence gets bigger and we expand our awareness and catch ourselves when we have these moments, these get smaller. But it's a cycle. Because I don't know all of the implicit bias I carry, the more aware I become of it, again, the smaller they become. But I don't have any data that suggests that we eliminate all of them. It's the work that we do, right? We continue to try to figure out how do we undo them and what are the steps that we need to take. And it's work. It's intentional, and it's a choice. So cultural conversations, thankfully I've had an opportunity to engage with several of you on some of that, just talking about culture, talking about the impact that it has, owning where we are as individuals. Where am I as an individual? What is the work that I've done? What do I need to do? How has my life journey influenced what I think of myself? And what groups am I aware of? And what knowledge do I have of them? Practice listening, that's huge. Active listening, really listening, slowing down our brains and listening to what is happening in conversation. And don't make it necessarily, Tiffany, I want to know everything there is to know about what it's like to be a Black woman. Don't make me responsible for that for you, please. As I would not do it for you. Like, there are ways in which we want to learn about others, but we also want to share who we are. It can't just be, let me make you my research project. But I also want to share my culture too, so we can learn together and it be collaborative. Being comfortable with discomfort. Some of this stuff is uncomfortable. Particularly if we've been socialized not to talk about it. Right? So learning to talk about it, finding people that I feel comfortable having these conversations. Not everybody's going to want to have these conversations. I'm very much aware of that. But finding those folks that you can engage with that helps you learn, and that we make choices to learn together, and that it will be uncomfortable sometimes. And we want to lean into that discomfort. And particularly from a Christian perspective, we know that there's learning when God puts us in certain situations that challenge us. And it doesn't always feel good. But we know that we're learning something new. Being patient with ourselves and others, that's a huge one, because we talk about giving each other grace. So what we're really trying to do is, keep listening, responding to questions and comments as things happen, particularly if there are people that you are in relationship with. I make a choice. My children always tease me because we could be in Walmart or somewhere and someone will say something to somebody and it could be a microaggression. And my kids will literally look at me like, Mom, please don't say anything. Please don't say anything. Or, she might whip out a PowerPoint at any given moment. Let me explain to you what you just said and how this could be offensive. So you have to pick your choices. You pick your battles. But my rule of thumb is if it happens in my neighborhood, my home, my classroom, my campus, and my team, people that I have relationship with, that I'm invested in, and I build those relationships, those are conversations we want to figure out how to have, okay? And it's not the random person, depending on, how invested you are in that. You make that choice. Talk about the conversation or situations in ways that help you express how something may have impacted you. There's this notion of intent versus impact. Well, I didn't mean it that way. Doesn't really matter. Once you say it or do it, it's gone. And you have to own those things and be willing to have the conversation with someone and to receive the feedback and to be able to give it sometime when something doesn't come out or go the way that maybe you thought it would, or you observe it and you need to help someone understand, let me help you think about how what you said might have impacted a student, a colleague, a parent. There's that opportunity for growth for all of us. And value seeing someone else's perspective and experiences. That notion of empathy and grace is huge as we continue this work. So what we're really trying to do is, we got some old habits, and depending on your age, you might have more so than others, myself included, and how we create new habits. So and it's work. Like, we have to kind of work at this. And again, it's very easy not to do it. Just keep doing what we've been doing. But if we're not intentional about it, it will maintain itself the way it is. So I want to just give you a couple of things to think about. That was my intention. And I'll just open up for questions, comments, thoughts, reactions, whatever you feel comfortable engaging in at this point. But thank you.